Hey, spooky people. Welcome to your bonus episode this week on Delphine LaLaurie. And I do have some stuff up and ready to go for the next episode on Marie Laveau next week. So they did kind of intertwine at some point, and I'm going to find those and I'll do that as an overall ending in the next episode. But today we're just going to focus on Delphine LaLaurie. She has a very long history, and a lot of the legend around her has been kind of mixed up. History's lines have been blurred a little bit due to the decades of just retellings of these stories. So I'm going to unblur those lines a little bit. We will talk about a couple of the different things that have been said. But either way, the things that she did to her slaves were absolutely terrible and horrific. So let's get into it. So the Delphine was born into the wealthy McCarty family, and the McCarty men of the family had military backgrounds, landowners, in politics. They were all just very prominent and wealthy. Her father, Louis Bartholomew de McCarty, which was originally McCarthy, but they shortened it to McCarty when they moved from Ireland to New Orleans in around 1730. Maybe not exactly in 1730, but it was around there. And this is during the French colonial period. Her father was knighted as Cavalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis, and by 1794 her family had 1,344 acres of plantation between Bartholomew and Independence, backing up to St. Claude Avenue and next door to the famously wealthy Count Pierre Philippe Mendeville de Marigny. No, this is not where the current mansion is, just so we're all on the same page. The McCartys were deeply embedded in the fabric of society, and the Delphine's upbringing is said to be privileged and of high social standing. She had nothing to worry about. She had a very wealthy upbringing. Was it good necessarily? I'm not quite sure. There's very little about her life in the beginning of her life, but that's also probably because very much of the information on her is about her atrocities. So her mother was Marie Jeanne L'Érable. I'm going to pronounce these wrong, guys, just so you're aware. There's a Spanish name in here somewhere with her first husband, and I'm going to probably get that wrong too. My apologies. Her mother was also known as the Widow Lecomte, and this is because Louis, he was her second husband. She loved to host. She loved to have parties, and the parties that she threw would go late into the night, into the early hours of the morning. And she also loved pranking. So during these parties, on some nights, it would include jumping into the canal that was on their property, and they would steal the clothes and shoes of male guests, which would then force those guests to go home in bare feet and nightshirts. So she really loved a good party and a good prank. That was like her thing. And then she would end up passing away in 1807. So after the death of her mother, her father explored companionship in an untraditional but popular manner. And a lot of the Creole men at the time would have relationships with freed women of color or of biracial descent. It was a popular thing to do. There was really not a lot of discrimination necessarily when it came to the Creole men and freed women of color, but keyword being freed. So her father would end up in a long-term relationship with a free woman, Sophie Musanti. In 1815, Sophie would then give birth to a daughter, Delphine Amici McCarty, and the godparents of that daughter would then be the Delphine and her brother Louis. Her uncle, who is also prominent, Esteban Rodriguez Miro, and he is an uncle by marriage of her, I believe, her first husband. He was governor of the Spanish American provinces of Louisiana and Florida during 1785 to 1791, and her cousin, Augustine de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. And a lot of the McCarty men did have relationships with free women of color or women of mixed race. And again, this was extremely popular thing. It wasn't just the McCartys, but it was a popular thing to do. So the Delphine's uncle Eugene would end up having a 54-year relationship with a woman of color, Eulalie Mandeville de Marigny. And this is the daughter of their neighbor, Count Marigny, who had relations with an enslaved woman and ended up having the daughter Eulalie. And Eugene and Eulalie had 7 children together, and it was a successful union. And Eulalie apparently may not have cared that Eugene had children with 2 other free women of color. So there were 5 children in total from other women, from the 2 other women, and then 7 from Eulalie. So that makes like what, 12 children in total? It's a lot of kids. So the Delphine's father, uncle, and cousins and associates highly contributed to the development of the biracial free people of color in New Orleans. And the women were referred to in the legal system as a concubine. The Creoles called them menagerie or placée, and research proves there were quite a few women of mixed race who were within and had relationships within the McCarty family. The Delphine, was born Marie Delphine McCarty in March 19th of 1789, and she was known for her charm, beauty, and refined manners. She was an active participant in the social life of New Orleans and was seen as a paragon of grace and sophistication, which is a far cry from her personality in private, which was far, far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And eventually, she will be revealed as a horrifying person, and the most horrifying things that she did later. But these things would continue to fascinate historians even today and the collective memory of New Orleans for generations. So we're hidden kind of a little less than 100 years until the Civil War, and the Delphine was only 4 years of age when the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791. And this eruption would then kind of put slaveholders in the southern states in the Caribbean kind of on edge, because they were also afraid of the resistance and rebellion among their slaves. Because once one happens, groups start getting inspired and would then follow suit. Happened in the revolution. Our revolution happened, and then a bunch of other revolutions happened. So they are worried about this. The Delphine's uncle was then killed in 1771 by his slaves. And then the revolution had inspired the local Mina conspiracy in 1791, the Pointe Coupe conspiracy in 1794, and the 1811 German Coast Uprising. And all of this caused slaveholders to abuse their slaves even more than they already did, because they were fear of insurrection. So the thought process was beat them down even harder and enough, and then they won't be able to rebel, which is why it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It was horrible to begin with, but it got real bad. So at the age of 13, she became involved in a scandalous affair with Ramon Lopez y Angulo, and he was 35 years old and a widower. And he had arrived in New Orleans to start his position of the intendante, I'm going to pronounce these wrong, second in command to the Spanish governor. And within 6 months, they were married. And his wife died on a voyage to New Orleans from Spain, and it wasn't a good voyage. It was a very treacherous voyage, and she ended up not making it. So, colonial officials at the time were required to obtain permission from the king in order to wed local women, and he didn't want to wait for a royal license. The correspondence in Spanish Archivo General de Indias says this, and he was apparently impatient to wait for the license. So, citing reasons of conscience and honor, quote unquote, he was able to convince a bishop of Louisiana to perform the ceremony, and June 25th of 1800 they were married. And eventually the news of the marriage will reach King Carlos IV, and Lopez was relieved of his duties and ordered back to Spain. He was then assigned to a low-level position in a backwater town. So it also states that Ramon was not thrilled with the crown, and it was probably because he harbored bitterness for the death of his wife. And it is on record of him saying that if they had postponed the voyage by a month, as he had requested, his wife would still be alive. So he held on to this, is why he would also start to kind of rebel. He also apparently opened up the importation of captives directly from Africa. And the orders from Spain that were implemented were the orders prohibited the importation until hostilities had settled. So it wasn't necessarily safe for the human trafficking industry around this time. And he was like, fuck it. I'm going to do what I want. And this would really piss off Spain. So remember, he's very angry with Spain. So he's going to just not listen to them and do the opposite of what they say. So he was reprimanded not just for this, but also for marrying without permission, and began to be shuffled around the world by the crown and would remove him from his position into this other position. And from here in his new position, he wrote a flood of letters to Spanish officials that he blamed for this quote unquote humiliating situation on powerful enemies in Louisiana and Spain. And the Delphine supposedly met with the queen. I don't think that is confirmed, but it is said supposedly that she met with the queen, and he was pardoned and sent into exile and would be eventually appointed to Spanish consul in New Orleans under the American administration. So at this time, the Delphine was pregnant and waiting for him in Havana, so that way they could return to New Orleans together. I could not find if they lived in Cuba or if she went from Spain to Cuba to New Orleans. I don't really know. I couldn't find that information, but they were meeting in Havana. That was the place, but they did live in New Orleans. So Ramon boarded a ship in Bordeaux so that way he could go back. And on January 11th of 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana and he was killed. And around this time, Delphine would then give birth to their daughter. And she would be named Marie Delphine Francisca Borja Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria. It's a very long name. And she was named in part for Ramon's dead wife. And then she stayed in Havana long enough to bury Ramon and have her daughter baptized before she would return to New Orleans. And she would now, return as a young widow and mother. And when she got back, she discovered that New Orleans was no longer under Spanish rule or French rule, and it was part of American ownership. So she returned to New Orleans with her daughter. She called her daughter Borquita, the diminutive of Bora. But the Delphine, doesn't sit around for long. And she would soon be married again to her second husband on her 20th birthday, March 19th, 1807. And just a few weeks after her mother died, she married the older Frenchman and widower Jean-Paul Blanc, a merchant, lawyer, banker, state legislator, and political intriguer who was also a slave trader, smuggler, an associate, so because of his part in the slave trade and politics and association with the notorious pirate brothers Jean and Pierre Lafitte, he was a very savvy businessman. And the Delphine's mother had divided her estate between the three children. And Blanc probably saw her inheritance as an opportunity. Her inheritance was $33,007, paid a healthy dowry for the marriage to her new husband. And her mother also left her a downtown plantation on the bank of the Mississippi River with 52 slaves and livestock and farm equipment. Her father also gifted her and Blanc another plantation property on Chartres Street, and an additional 26 slaves. So today in value, her inheritance is over $2 million. Blanc would then go on to purchase a 2-story townhome on Royal and Conti next door to the Bank of Louisiana. And he was the director at this bank. And then by 1815, they had 5 children, the eldest being the daughter from Delphine's first husband. And they would then split their home between the townhome and their plantation. And they also secured a privileged life for themselves. But also, things are not always as they seem, and nothing is ever what is portrayed, especially in high society homes. In 1814, Blanc delivered Jean Lafitte's famous letter to Governor Claiborne, in which Lafitte offered his men to help defend New Orleans against the British in the War of 1812. Blanc would then die in 1815, leaving Delphine to settle his massive debt and raise 5 young children. And the inheritance from her father, plus her own shrewd business dealings, would then put her on a solid financial footing. And by the time she met Louis LaLaurie, she was very, very wealthy. So by the time Blanc died, she was only 28 years old. And his debts totaled over $160,000 at the time. And in today's currency, it was $2.5 million. So she would renounce her community property to the courts and forfeit all of their mutual assets to keep her personal property. And then over the next 10 years, she would auction off much of Blanc's property, including the enslaved persons, to try and pay off his. She even purchased a piece of his property herself at auction and retained some of his slaves. So she paid off his debt with some of her own money as well. So she was still extremely wealthy. It wasn't like his debts were put on her and it just devastated her. She could pay it. She could 100% pay it. But she was stuck with it. But again, she was still extremely wealthy. Her inheritance equaled like $2 million and his debt was over 2.5. Again, she had her own way of getting money and she was very good at it. So records show that 8 of the enslaved people she had now owned from him in a span of about 5 years. Most were children or women of childbearing age, which the causes of death are quote unquote unknown. So the debt that Blanc left behind could have depleted her wealth, obviously. The debt that Blanc left behind could have depleted LaLaurie's wealth. Obviously, he had over $2.5 million worth of debt in today's standards. Her father would pass away in 1824, and he left his children with a substantial inheritance for the time. His children, with a free woman of color, were included in his will, and the Delphine got $5,000 and 2 slaves. So in 1815, Hillary settled Blanc's estate, and she was skillfully able to manage the land and slaves inherited from both of her parents. As a result, she was very wealthy. And then she met her third husband, Dr. Louis LaLaurie, and in 1825, he was 16 years younger than her, and he had just arrived in New Orleans after graduating medical school in France. He is directly associated with the events surrounding the fire and the tortured slaves. Just keep that in mind. In February of 1825, LaLaurie, who was a son of a respectable middle-class man in the French village of, I'm going to ruin this, Villeneuve-sur-Lot, I know I said that wrong, arrived in New Orleans from Bordeaux on the ship of Fanny. 22 years old, fresh out of medical school, and he appeared to have been naive but ambitious, and he came to the New World to seek fortune. So his mission was to start his physician practice of quote unquote destroying hunches. Basically, he's a chiropractor, quote unquote, straightening crooked backs. And in 1826, one of Delphine's children needed help being quote unquote straightened out. And this is supposedly how their romance began. One version of the story says that he became acquainted with the wealthy Delphine because she had a quote unquote crippled child whose condition he attempted to correct. One of Delphine's daughters did, in fact, have a disability. It was probably Pauline, but the letters from LaLaurie's family refer to his treatment of Mademoiselle Blanc, the hunchback young lady. That poor girl. There was also the fact that LaLaurie was an older woman. She was 38 with 2 dead husbands, 5 children, but she also had a lot of wealth. So you can speculate how the relationship bloomed, so to speak. So between 1825 and 1827, Louis received numerous letters from his father. His father was urging him to establish himself in the medical field, marry a rich girl, and return to France. He would frequent references to Madame Blanc, as in Delphine, and he regarded her as well-to-do and influential older woman who could help advance Louis's career. But he did not mean that as a potential daughter-in-law. Popular legend has characterized Louis LaLaurie as an inconspicuous and colorless non-entity, a meek, mousy little man, but Delphine evidently found him quite attractive. And then by 1826, the relationship between them had become intimate, and the Delphine got pregnant. Their son, Jean-Louis LaLaurie, was born August 13th of 1827. The St. Louis Cathedral marriage and baptismal records show that the couple did not marry until 5 months later, on January 12th, 1828. In a contract enacted on the day of their wedding, the Delphine specified that she would retain control over her personal property, real estate, and slaves, together worth $67,000. And LaLaurie brought only $2,000 to the marriage, and even that was tied up in his late mother's estate. So there's only speculation about the relationship between them. Did Delphine, a 40-year-old grandmother who had been widowed for 10 years, develop a passion for the young man? Or was it LaLaurie who pursued Delphine in response to his father's injunction to marry a lady with money? We may never know. But we know one thing for sure, that she became pregnant out of wedlock, and he was born 5 months, their son was born 5 months before their marriage in 1828. Okay, so rolling back to their marriage on June 25th, 1825, it is said also that when their property finances were sorted out, they headed over to the St. Louis Cathedral to make it legal in the eyes of the Catholic Church. But it has been discovered that the date of their marriage was rolled back 6 months because of having a child out of wedlock would have been frowned upon in the circle of high society. So they were officially married on June 25th, 1825. But on paper, their marriage was rolled back to January. So that way, the child would not have been conceived out of wedlock on paper. So she's now on her third husband, the Delphine. She's 40. He's 25. New father, new country, with a wealthy wife. There are archived letters written by friends that mention the marriage was not happy. They were known to fight and often separate and then return to each other. So it was an on-again, off-again relationship, but they were married. And some of them make early mentions of the cruelty towards the slaves. Okay, so there were some revealing observations about the Delphine and her new husband, and they are found in the Stay Gimme family, I hope I said that right, papers at the historic New Orleans collection. And over a period of many years, Jean Bowes, who was a business manager of Henry de Stay Gimme's gentility plantation, he sent gossipy letters to his employer in France. And they would say that the Delphine and Louis had been married less than a year when Bowes wrote that Madame Blanc has married a young French doctor. They do not have a happy household. They fight, they separate, and then they return to each other. They would make one believe that someday they will abandon each other completely. And then during the first years of their marriage, the LaLauries lived in Delphine's riverfront plantation below the city. But she had her eyes set on the mansion that sits today, that was under construction at the corner of Royal and Governor Nichols. And then at that time, it was called Hospital Street. In 1831, she would purchase the lots on Royal and Hospital, which is now Governor Nichols, and those would become the infamous haunted LaLaurie Mansion. It was a lavish home in the View car, but because it was, there and it was lavish, it didn't mean that their home was happy. So she managed in her own name, with little involvement of her husband, to have this property herself. And on November 16th, 1832, the two-story mansion was built, complete with attached slave quarters. And then she lived at the residence with her third husband and two other daughters, and maintained a central position in New Orleans society. They hosted many lavish parties, but the information about her treatment towards her slaves would start to surface. So again, early in their marriage, there were signs of strain. And on November 16th, 1832, the couple proved incompatible, and they were separated much of the time. They lived apart. The Delphine at some point petitioned the First Judicial District Court for the separation from bed and board of her husband, in which she claimed that LaLaurie had treated her in such a manner as to render her living together unsupportable. Claims which her son and two daughters by Jean Blanc confirmed. And she also claimed in the presence of many witnesses that he beat and wounded her in the most outrageous and cruel manner. She then would ask the judge to authorize her to live separately from her husband in the home that she now occupies with her family. And LaLaurie stated before a notary that his medical practice required spending most of his time in Plaquemines Parish. And according to people, it's difficult to imagine that he was pursuing a career of orthopedics in this remote outpost instead of establishing his medical practice in the city of New Orleans. According to 64 parishes, maybe he served as a general practitioner for the planters and their slaves, or maybe he found a more agreeable female companion. We just don't know, because he was like a chiropractor, so there was really no need for him to be out in the parish. But just because they were separated does not mean that it was permanent. And he was seen at the house on April 10th, 1834, the day of the fire, with direct association. So despite the significant age difference and rumors of marital strife, the couple maintained a prominent social presence, and they would still hold lavish parties attended by the elite. So along with the unhappy marriage rumors, news of the Delphine's mistreatment of her slaves would start to circulate. And in 1828, LaLaurie's letter to Henry de Stigimi Bowes mentioned that Madame LaLaurie's abuses had come to light. Quote unquote, quote, finally justice descended on her home, and after being assured of the truth of the denunciations for barbarous treatment of her slaves contrary to the law, the authorities found them still all bloody, unquote. In 1829, Bowes wrote to his employer that Madame LaLaurie had been found not guilty by an indulgent jury. And in 1832, he communicated to Stigimi that she had been indicted by criminal court for abusing slaves, but was able to clear herself by paying a sum of money. So there was, slavery. Now, it did seem, reading about this in New Orleans, was that there was still a line, and you did not cross that line with the slaves. And the mistreatment that she did to them was a little more than what was acceptable. When I say a little more, I mean a lot more. And we'll get into that. So, unfortunately, the criminal records for this time period have been lost. So, there's no documentation for 1828, 1829, or 1832. And a very important piece of evidence did, however, come to light on June 22nd, 1829. John Randolph Grimes, he was one of the most famous attorneys at the time. He had signed a document saying that he had received of Madame LaLaurie $300 for his fee for defending the prosecution of the state against her in criminal court. And this would certainly be a criminal case described by Jean Bowes in his letter of July 20th, 1829. And accounts of Delphine's treatment of the people she enslaved between 1831 and 1834. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838, says, recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during 1836, she claimed that the enslaved people of LaLaurie were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched when compared to other enslaved individuals. However, at least in public appearances, LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to Black people and solicitous of the health of those enslaved. So she was a very, very good actor. She was able to convince people that she treated her slaves well, but in the dark of night, in the cover of her home, she was not like that at all. So there are funeral registers between 1830 and 1834 that document deaths of 12 enslaved people at her mansion, and the causes of death are not mentioned. There was a woman named, I'm going to assume it's Bonnie, but it's Bonne. She was alive from circa 1803 to February 7th, 1833. A cook and laundress and her 4 children, Juliet, circa 1820 to February 21st, 1833, at age 13. Florence, circa 1821 to February 16th, 1831. She was 10. Jules, circa 1827 to May 29th, 1833, at the age of 6. And the youngest, Leontine, circa 1829 to August 26, 1831, aged 1934. Bonnie had previously been enslaved by a refugee from St. Dominique and was described during her sale as a chronic runaway. Court records of the time show that LaLaurie freed 2 captive enslaved people, Jean Lewis in 1819 and Devins in 1832. Martineau wrote that public rumors about her mistreatment of slaves at the Royal Street residence were sufficiently widespread, so much so that the local lawyer was dispatched to the property to remind LaLaurie of the laws for the upkeep of enslaved people. And during this visit, the lawyer found no evidence to say that there was any wrongdoing or mistreatment by LaLaurie on enslaved peoples. So when she got married to her third husband and moved into the Royal Street estate, she did immediately take control of a large number of slaves that she used as servants. She was also a well-known sadist, and the mistreatment of enslaved workers by wealthy and socially connected was not a matter for the police at the time. So, oh, they're rich. That sucks. We're not going to do anything, is basically what I got from that. So in 1833, it said that Delphine chased a small enslaved girl with a whip until she fell off the roof of the house and died. LaLaurie tried to cover up the incident, but police found the body hidden in a well, and authorities decided to find LaLaurie and force the sale of the other enslaved people in the estate. Jeanne de Levine would account the incident, and she said she gave the child the age of 12 and she named her Leah. And later it would be elaborated on the case, saying that Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair and hit a snag, which would then anger LaLaurie at the point that she grabbed a whip and started chasing her. And then according to Martineau, the incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 enslaved people of the household. But these 9 would then be bought back by the LaLauries through a relative, and then they would return to the mansion. So LaLaurie secretly arranged for relatives and friends to buy the enslaved workers, and then she would sneak them back into the mansion so she could continue to torture them until the night of the fire. This is going to be in multiple parts. I can do 2. We don't mind longer episodes, right? We should be fine. I try to keep them short, but this one, there was a lot of information to this one. And then we will do Marie Laveau after. So next week, I'll do part 2 of this. And then the week after that, we will do Marie Laveau. And then maybe, if that doesn't take super long, a crossover of Marie Laveau and Madame LaLaurie. And then it'll all be wrapped up and it'll be good, except for the dolls. The dolls is going to take a couple more episodes, maybe more like. Anyway, I'm rambling. As always, if you go ghost hunting, please don't forget the salt and stay spooky.